It's not easy being green, but here's why I love it. So, there are a couple ways to make a game for the Game Boy, but the one I've chosen and used for the last 3 years has been GB Studio. The biggest benefit to GB Studio over actual code-based game development environments, like using GBDK and a programming language like C or assembly, is how so much of the basics for any game are already built into the software, making it far easier and faster to make a game from scratch if you aren't proficient at code, or if you just want to make something really small for a personal project or a game jam. You can make something compact, fun, and original in a very short amount of time, and it can even be exported and played right on original hardware or on an emulator if you choose. However, there are major trade-offs in performance, a lack of things like arrays in the development engine, as well as an initial project size that's about double what the smallest 90s era Game Boy game would have been. So 64 kilobytes versus 32 kilobytes. The software also lends itself a lot better to some genres of game than others, with a built-in focus on side view platformers, scrolling shooters, or top-down adventure games. That's not to say that you couldn't make other things, as I've done plenty of that within GB Studio. My games range from turn-based RPGs to visual novels or gallery shooters. It's just a lot harder to get that stuff off the ground. With that in mind, I'll be describing Game Boy game development from the specific perspective of a GB Studio developer for this talk. The Game Boy offers some very strict limitations on game development that I really think provide an excellent environment for creative solutions. The first that most people think of, and is probably the most obvious, is that classic color palette. Almost black, darkish green, lightish green, and off-white. Call them whatever you want, but 4 colors is all you get, so you better learn to make the most of them. Especially since you actually only get access to 3 of those colors for anything that isn't in the background. And speaking of which, the next big limitation is usable screen resolution. The Game Boy screen is a nearly square 160 by 144 pixels, width to height. And inside that space, your considerations will only compound since you have a specific number of sprites that can be shown on the same horizontal line of the screen before things just start to disappear. Plus, sprites and background tiles fight with each other for resources, which affects the hardware's overall performance capabilities. It adds up to a lot that can get in the way of a large vision for a project. So if you're like me, and you simply can't keep your scope small, that just means you have to be a little extra creative. But why the Game Boy? Why do I, humble game purveyor that I am, put up with all of the restrictions, the limitations, the inconsistencies between hardware and color displays, and the myriad other thorns in the side that come with developing for technology that's basically as old as I am? Well, it's easy enough to chalk it up to a diehard love for this stupid gray rectangle and all of its relatives, my favorite being the Game Boy Pocket, personally. But I really do believe that working within the confines of something as technically and uncompromisingly limited as the Game Boy has made me a better game designer. It's made me a better artist, and even a better fan of other games overall. I've always been a fan of pixel art and had been making my own way before I started working with GB Studio, but being forced to figure out how to best represent my ideas on this smallest of screens with barely enough colors or pixel count to spare has really been invaluable experience. An unintended effect, I guess it could be said, is that when I play games now, especially other Game Boy games, new and old, I pay more attention than ever to the artistry in how things are depicted. I may speculate or try to educatedly guess, if I'm able, how a developer might have done that cool thing that they did in their game that I liked so much. Even if a game is bad, or not to my taste, which happens frequently as my best friend and I play through the entire US library of original Game Boy releases for our weekly podcast, I try to find something to appreciate in the art or the music or the way that the limited space and resources were used to make the game what it is or was. Did the game slow down heavily in certain areas? How might I have accounted for or fixed that? What if it was in one of my own projects? Was there a really thematic or expressive level or cutscene? Could I replicate the technique in GB Studio? It all seems like extra problems that maybe I don't really need to solve, but my work wouldn't be the same without this level of appreciation and knowledge that I've gained over time. And I guess maybe I would be lying a little if I said it wasn't at least partially because I just love the Game Boy, up and down. All that may be well and good, but looking at a few scenes from some of my games show large and detailed images that, if you aren't familiar with what's possible on the Game Boy hardware, could really give the impression that they're not actually being presented within the software or running on an actual Game Boy. That isn't unusual nowadays. After all, there are plenty of devs out there making cool games in things like Godot or Game Maker, and they adopt the color palette and pixel aesthetic of the Game Boy for a hit of nostalgia or maybe to test their own limits. But these kinds of games could never actually run on a real Game Boy in your hands, and that just doesn't sit right with me for my own work. I want to make the best games that I can, that I'm satisfied with, and that I can put on a cartridge and play on any Game Boy with batteries inside it. So what kind of tricks do I use for my own work? Well, kind of a lot, actually. There's amazing tools both within the Game Boy's own ecosystem, as well as those in the modern GB community that can do a lot to help take full advantage of what's possible when making a real Game Boy game. It can honestly be a little overwhelming sometimes, but I'm happy to shed some light here, if I'm able, by going over a tool I use extensively in my work, as well as talk about something I've learned that can really help with both inspiration and working within the Game Boy's limits. Making these games for almost half a decade at this point has presented me with a lot of hurdles to overcome. But my hope is that this information might prevent others from taking as long to clear those same hurdles. Easily, one of my favorite and most utilized Game Boy tools is none other than the hardware's own accessory cartridge, the Game Boy camera. There is something so wildly special to me about using the Game Boy to take real-life photographs, even just in isolation. But the ability to transfer them to my computer for use in some project or other, another level entirely. The Game Boy camera looks just so good. I feel that its best features are how it handles shadows and outlines through a combination of extreme instances of dithering and a tendency to not use completely solid lines, preferring to break things up with the other colors in the palette instead. However, going straight from the GB camera to insertion into a project is not a one-to-one process. There's a few hiccups that can cause problems, depending on the complexity of the image and what it's being used for. GB camera images aren't the same 160 by 144 pixels that the Game Boy natively expects. While they're not drastically smaller, they're only 128 by 112 pixels, with a solid color border taking up the remaining space between the image edges and the Game Boy's screen limits. This means some adjustments might have to be made to the image's size, or you'll have to put your own frame of sorts to fill up that space. For images like the one in this slide, I used that text box at the top of the screen to handle some of this issue, and then I used some copy and pasting on the sides to just expand those dithered areas all the way out to the screen edges. But even that isn't the end of the process to get the image to work within a GB Studio project. Without breaking all of this down into technical minutiae, there's only so many tiles that a scene can use for any image, no matter how big the scene itself actually is. And while there is a scene type in GB Studio made specifically for images like these, it's called the logo type scene. If you want to include things like dialogue, sprite movement, or pretty much just anything other than the raw image on its own, that type of scene won't work. So you'll be squeezing and scraping tiles down to get the image to fit into the typical limits for what can actually turn out to be an agonizing span sometimes. If you're interested in GB camera photography for yourself, whether for fun or for use in any of your own projects, there's 2 amazing online tools that you can use for just that purpose. And you don't even need to acquire your own cartridge or Game Boy. System of Levers tool, Pick to GB, is a small piece of software online that allows you to take any picture and get it converted into a nearly identical facsimile of a GB camera picture. You can adjust the contrast and brightness, same as on the real thing. Plus, you can set it to only take up a certain amount of tiles, which is great for GB Studio, but it can cause a lot of the details that you would really want in the image to go missing. And it also exports the images in 160 by 144 pixel resolution, or larger multiples if you need that for whatever reason. So there's no worrying about resizing or negative space here. Maple Mavica Syrup's online webcam version of the GB camera, called WebGB Cam, has tons of personality and functions as a regular webcam that accesses the one built into a laptop or a mobile phone. It also looks great compared to actual hardware, and you can use it for still images, timed photos, or just a standard webcam. There's even color palettes that you can swap between, and the contrast and brightness settings that come with the original version are there too. It's very cute and lots of fun to use. As for that inspiration I mentioned earlier, there's a lot that can be learned from not only playing games of the era that the Game Boy originates from, that being the 1990s, but also from spending time critically engaging with other forms of media as well. Inspiration can and should come from everywhere. Whether your influences are out in the open or buried under secrets and Easter eggs, you should always have those influences for your work. And when it comes to the small screen, low amount of colors, and struggle for visual and mechanical performance that you deal with on the Game Boy, there are 2 specific areas that I feel really offer a lot that they can teach about how to make the most out of that very little. So I'll share those with you and a few images from each here. The first is anime, or cartoons, or other animated features from before the 1990s, especially animated media from around the 1960s and 1970s. In them, you can find lots of flat colors, heavy lines, and minimal expressions that get used and reused to communicate things under a budget or time constraint. The examples that I have here are an explosion from Mobile Suit Gundam and a shock transition from Fist of the North Star. But I've spent time poring over backgrounds in Scooby-Doo Where Are You? And the original Pink Panther cartoons as well. Lots of the techniques used in older animations can almost be directly applied to how you would animate or use colors or direct action or show movement and emotion using cutscenes and sprites on something made for the Game Boy. The second area is manga. They're already in grayscale on the page, and you will likely never see such awesome examples of hatching, dithering, and other noise effects put to paper. The image I'm using here is from the horror manga Fuon no Tane, which has some truly void-like uses of darkness and shadow for its otherworldly happenings. But if you need examples of negative space used well, extreme emotions, or shading and other complementary effects, especially on a limited palette, It really doesn't get much better than manga to study on. At the end of the day, though, taking inspiration from whatever it is that actually inspires you is what matters. Whether it's a story from your tabletop RPG group, or an entry from your personal journal, a song that you can't get out of your head, a mechanic from a game that just missed the mark, or a scene from a movie that you just know you could have made more impactful. Put those things into your work. On the Game Boy, the limitations are always there for you to bang into, no matter what you bring to it. But that doesn't mean that you can't still create something that makes a big impact, or tells a compelling story, or feels like a game brought over from a bigger system. With all of the talk of techniques and restrictions, appreciation and compromise, that's what I really want the takeaway here to be. The Game Boy can be a lot of things, big or small, but it's still the same old rectangle at the end of the day, and what you or I are able to do with it is ultimately up to us. And as someone with a real love for my favorite handheld, I can only hope to see plenty more awesome new Game Boy games in the future. So thank you so much for listening to me ramble about the Game Boy and why I use it to make my games. If you took anything constructive from it, great. I really hope some of you play around with the Game Boy camera, or maybe give GB Studio a shot and make something for yourself. Either way, thank you again for your time and for having me at Colliders today.